So let me just tell you a little bit about influenza. So when I talk about avian influenza, I mean the influenza types that affect primarily avian species, poultry, wild waterfowl, things like that, because we also have things out there like swine influenzas. The difference between the term low path and high path, if a virus is isolated out of a flock, they're going to send it to a diagnostic laboratory that does some specialized tests to determine if it's low path or high path. Usually it's pretty obvious. Low path, it's a very mild disease. In some cases, you may not even know that the flock was exposed to it. If there is mortality with low path, it's often because there's been some secondary bacteria like E. coli as often. With high path, a severe disease, you're going to have higher mortality, you can have neurological signs, respiratory signs, and a lot of the flock will die in a short period of time. Influenzas have two names, an H and an N, and that's how we designate what they are. Low path can be any type, an H1, an H5, an H9. Normally, though, with high path, it has typically been the H5s and the H7s. Those are the ones that become high path. Okay, how do they do that? If we have a low path influenza virus and we allow it to circulate multiple times through susceptible flocks where people said, well, there were no clinical signs, so I didn't really know I even had a problem. The more times that it goes through susceptible populations, it will start to mutate and it will take on the ability to be highly pathogenic. I put the picture of the duck in here because wild waterfowl are one of the natural reservoirs. This virus in general does not cause mortality and sickness in wild waterfowl. So that's why they can harbor it for a long period of time, and we see increases in their populations often as they're migrating north and then coming back down south. Let me give you just a little bit of background to set the tone for what happened in the U.S. because you may not be familiar with, what type of programs. So you may say, well, maybe they didn't know they had this low path virus and they allowed it to go through flocks. There are some national programs within the United States under the National Poultry Improvement Program Plan and through cooperation with the various industries. And every flock is tested pre-slaughter. So every turkey flock, every broiler flock, before it goes to market, is going to be tested, blood tested for influenza. And this allows us to know what's going on in the population and put control programs in place so that if you find low path, you can do something about it to stop it from becoming high path. If it's high path influenza, then it's the same as within Canada, where it's a foreign animal disease and the flock is going to be depopulated, which means euthanized on the farm. In addition to that, there have been some industry programs which are the secure supply plans for eggs, broilers, and turkeys. And this has been a joint project between people in the universities that are the academics with industry and also government being involved. And what they were looking at is, well, if we have high path influenza in a certain area and we have a control zone, how do we manage our business continuity during that time? So it's putting a lot of measures and rules and a plan in place before something happens to prevent the spread, to contain it, but also to allow people to continue their businesses. So I'm going to just give you a summary of what happened. So here we look at a virus that affected 223 farms in 15 different states over a 6-month time period. It affected primarily turkeys. We lost 10 million turkeys, and we lost 40 million laying chickens during the 6-month time period. It was the largest animal disease outbreak in the U.S., not just poultry disease, animal disease, period. The other one, too, is just to bring it a little bit down. Sometimes people think the entire U.S. industry is integrated. There are a lot of individual producers. So all of these photos here, these are, turkey families in Iowa. And what this represented to them is, at a minimum, they had 3 months with no birds on their farm. You imagine how that affects your cash flow. You're waiting for your government compensation, and that's all going to take time. The other one, we're still dealing with the impact of that, is because a lot of turkey breeders were lost. So that meant flocks had to be molted. That affects the poult quality. The U.S. imported over 5 million hatching turkey eggs out of Europe in order to try and fill the loss. And of course, if you don't have birds, then you don't need feed. So we have all the trickle-down effect on the industry. If we look at the layer industry, Iowa by far, because of all of the large complexes there, was hardest hit. But overall in the U.S., not only did they lose 11% of their laying hens, but they lost 6% of the replacement pullets. Okay, if we just take a look at what happened here in terms of a timeline, from in early December, you can see in the green that most of the cases were over on the West Coast. And some of these weren't H5N2, they were in H5N8. But nevertheless, they were a high path avian influenza, and a lot of them weren't necessarily in large commercial operations. They could have been in smaller type of, backyard flocks or even in a wild bird population. Beginning of March is when it first hit in the Midwest, and it spread fairly quickly within Minnesota and Iowa. If we look, and this shows you the number of cases that occurred in chickens and turkeys in Minnesota and Iowa. So when we talk about a control zone, if a farm is infected, then we have the 3-kilometer infected zone and a 10-kilometer control zone. The state of Minnesota had over 13,000 square kilometers that were control zones. Okay, so now you think about even just those 1,800 extra people that they hired. It's all of this to try and prevent things from spreading. So what happened? They had good surveillance programs. What happened? Influenza is not new within the U.S. and it's not new within the Midwest. You think about Minnesota, all the small lakes that they have there. They always have influenza every year, but it's usually not high path influenza. So they've been through the drill. They know what the appropriate industry response is. But it's just that. The industry was prepared for a tornado, something that comes, touches down, here's a farm that's infected, how are we going to deal with it? And what happened was the tsunami. And by that, what I mean is that this virus was quite different. And instead of that single point introduction, we had simultaneous hits in large areas. And so therefore, the resources to deal with the control of it became very limited and became exhausted very quickly. And one of the most critical points is not being able to keep up with the depopulation of positive flocks.